Welcome to this deep dive,
Okay.
and we're going to explore something that you might not expect.
Okay.
The relationship between photography and power.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we're going to be taking a look at John Tagg's book, The Disciplinary Frame, to kind of uncover how these pictures, even seemingly innocent ones, aren't just, capturing reality. They're actually like wrapped up in these systems of control,
Yeah.
you know, legal, social, you name it.
Yeah, that's right. We often think of photos as these neutral windows to the world.
Right.
But Tagg argues that they're embedded in power structures right from the start, and that they're influencing how we understand and see the world.
Uh-huh.
And he even uses this phrase that I find really interesting, the violence of meaning.
The violence of meaning.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued, but I'm also a little confused. What does that even mean?
Yeah, well, it's a powerful phrase. It's about how photographs can be used to impose identities and narratives, often without the subject's consent.
Okay.
So it's not like a photo is literally violent, but more about how the photo can be used to, exert control and shape perceptions in a way that can be really harmful.
So it's not about like a photo being literally violent.
Ugh.
It's about how it's used to kind of
Exactly.
control the narrative.
Yeah.
To tell a story that might not be the whole truth.
Exactly. And this isn't just an abstract theory. Tagg gives the example of police photographs from the 19th century.
Oh, okay.
Those mugshots, they weren't just pictures. They were tools that were used to categorize and criminalize people.
Uh-huh.
And the simple act of taking someone's picture suddenly became linked to the enforcement of the law.
Wow.
That's a really good example.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize that a photograph is never truly objective.
Right.
There's always a context. There's always a purpose behind it.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that purpose is about maintaining power.
That's exactly right. And, this idea of photography as a tool of power is very deeply connected to the rise of the modern state.
And Tagg draws on the work of Philip Bobbitt, who argues that the modern state, as we know it, emerged in 15th century Italy.
Okay.
And he thinks it was partly driven by the need for what he calls new forms of social control.
New forms of social control.
Yeah.
So what led to that need?
Well, Bobbitt argues that it was actually a technological advancement,
Okay.
the development of mobile artillery,
What?
cannons specifically.
So cannons.
Yeah.
Okay.
This new weaponry meant that cities needed better defenses
Uh-huh.
and more organized governments to be able to protect themselves.
Wow. So cannons basically like forced governments to kind of get their act together.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
That's a fascinating connection between military technology and the evolution of the state.
It really is. And, as these states became more powerful,
Mm-hmm.
they needed ways to track and classify and manage their populations.
Right.
And photography, with its ability to capture and categorize visual information, became a crucial tool for achieving this.
So we're seeing like this feedback loop here.
Yep.
Technology changes warfare. Warfare changes the state.
Right.
And then the state uses new technologies like photography to further its authority.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating interplay between technology, power, and the way that societies evolved.
Totally.
And, this brings us to another key point, that Tagg explores the rise of documentary photography and its connection to power, particularly this idea of documentary realism.
Whenever I think about like those iconic photos from the Great Depression,
Yeah.
I always get this feeling of realness, like I'm
Right.
looking through this window to that time. But what you're saying is that maybe I shouldn't take that realism at face value.
That's right. While many documentary photographers genuinely aim to capture the truth, we have to acknowledge that even realism is often constructed.
Okay, so can you give me an example of what you mean?
Sure, let's take Margaret Bourke-White's famous photograph of the Louisville flood victims.
Okay.
They're standing in this bread line right in front of a billboard proclaiming there's no way like the American way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That image is so powerful. The contrast between the billboard's message and the reality of those people's lives is so striking.
Exactly. And that was precisely the point. Bourke-White carefully staged that image for maximum impact.
Wow.
She understood the power of that visual irony.
So even in documentary photography, where we expect a certain level of objectivity,
Right.
there's this element of control,
Yes.
of shaping the narrative to kind of achieve a desired effect.
Absolutely. Now, this doesn't diminish the value of documentary photography,
Right.
but it does raise important questions about the role of the photographer in constructing meaning.
Uh-huh.
How much control does the person behind the lens have in shaping our understanding of the world?
That's a really important point to consider. It's like we trust photographs as these documents of reality.
Right.
But maybe we should be a little bit more critical, a little more aware of the choices that the photographer is making.
Exactly. And this is where comparing Burke White's approach to someone like Walker Evans is so fascinating.
Tagg describes Evans' work as having this melancholic realism,
Interesting.
a kind of resistance to overt messaging.
So he wasn't trying to stage dramatic scenes or push a particular agenda?
Right. One of the photographs that Tagg analyzes is this street in Atlanta.
Okay.
And it just so happens to feature advertisements for a movie called Chatterbox.
Uh-huh.
But even in this seemingly simple image, Tagg reveals these layers of representation and meaning.
It's like even without deliberate staging, a photograph can be loaded with implied meanings messages that we might not even be conscious of.
Exactly.
It all comes down to context and how we as viewers interpret what we see.
Exactly. And this leads us to another crucial point that Tagg makes.
Okay.
Despite all of these efforts to control meaning, there's always pushback.
I like that.
People find ways to resist those imposed narratives,
Yeah.
to create their own stories.
There's something inherently human about that, I feel like.
Yeah.
That desire to resist being put in a box to define ourselves on our own terms.
Absolutely. And Tagg provides a great example of this, the emergence of zoot suit culture in the 1940s.
Yeah, those zoot suits were so stylish
Yeah.
and subversive.
Yes, they definitely made a statement.
They did.
They were a deliberate rejection of the dominant culture's attempts to define identity.
Uh-huh.
It was a form of resistance that was expressed through clothing, through style.
It's amazing how something as simple as a suit can become like a symbol of rebellion.
Right. And so what Tagg is saying is that even with all these tools like photography to control the narrative,
Yeah.
people will always find ways to create their own meanings, to push back against those attempts to define them.
You like that?
And this brings us to a final point, I think,
Yeah.
for this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
The way that art history itself constructs and controls meaning through framing.
Wait, are you saying that even in the art world,
Yeah.
with its emphasis on like creativity and self-expression,
Yeah.
that there are these systems of power at play?
Absolutely. We talk about art being framed in a certain way, right? Well, Tagg uses that word frame, literally and metaphorically.
Okay.
He's saying that art history itself imposes these structures of meaning, and those frames are not neutral. They reflect power dynamics within the art world.
So how we understand a piece of art isn't just about the artist's intention or the artwork itself.
Right.
It's about who gets to decide what's important, what gets seen, and how it gets presented.
You got it. And Tagg uses a really intriguing artwork by John Baldessari
Okay.
called Two Crowds to illustrate this concept of framing and power dynamics.
Okay.
It literally features two crowds in different contexts separated by a big white